Welcome to Advanced Dungeons and Testing Dragons, Temple of the Golden Cobra. Your knowledge of test-driven development has allowed you to defeat the simple cookbooks that live within your organizations. But before you now stands a multi-platform cookbook that wields custom resources and helper methods and exploits search. This adventure will test your mettle as we delve through the dark corners of cookbook development. You will strengthen your powers in RSpec, learn the wild secrets of the Ruby language, and begin the treacherous climb to ChefSpec mastery. Through carefully crafted exercises, you will gain the skills necessary to accomplish the unthinkable and test such a cookbook. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am your host, Franklin Weber. I am a technical trainer at Chef, and what you are about to participate in is a workshop that I presented at ChefConf 2016. For those that were able to attend it, thank you very much. Hopefully this will serve as a great review, and for those that weren't able to attend it. I hope that this information, this workshop, making it available online to you, will help you grow your learning and knowledge. Let me give you an idea of who I think you are. I assume that you're a level 4 to level 6 chef cookbook author. And what I mean by level 4 to level 6 is that you understand chef resources. You have written resources, you have written them into recipes, you have put them into cookbooks, you have taken those cookbooks, you've versioned them, and you've uploaded them to your chef server or use Chef Solo to distribute them to your systems. You've also created cookbooks with dependencies on one another. So you've created cookbooks that are perhaps wrapper cookbooks of additional cookbooks or complicated cookbooks that use one with the other. You may even have some experience with custom resources, which we're going to explore briefly in this content. And most importantly, you have some understanding of testing basics. So you have worked with or written a little bit of RSpec, but hopefully or InSpec and maybe some ChefSpec. And that's hopefully or where we're going to focus most of our content. So we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on ChefSpec and RSpec. And the reason I specifically chose for this workshop to focus on ChefSpec and RSpec is that it made it easier to present this content and allowing everyone to work through the exercises on their own systems, because all you'll need to have installed is the Chef Development Kit. All right, so it's what I think about you, who you are in the content. There's several scenarios that this content is broken down into. We're currently in the introduction, but there are 6 scenarios that we are going to be going through for the entire workshop. And I'll go into a little bit of each one of these, but before I do, I want to give you an idea of what each one of these scenarios looks like. So at the beginning of each one of these scenarios, I'm going to give you a D&D flavored intro, something that tells you that you're entering some part of the dungeon using as many adjectives as I can to represent the word damp or funky, smelly, something like that. I'll try to include as many adjectives as possible to make it sort of an interesting introduction. With that introduction, or with that complete, I'm going to outline the encounter. So you'll likely run into some sort of puzzle or problem. In this case, it could be some enemies to defeat or a puzzle to solve in some way. And really the encounter is going to outline the code problem or the essentially cookbook implementation or the test implementation that you're going to have to solve to make everything right. Then I'm going to give you the concepts. So what's going to happen is I'm going to explain to you the techniques that you would use to solve the encounter, right? So I've outlined a problem, and then I'm going to give you the tools or techniques to solve that problem. And then I'm going to give you an exercise. And during that exercise, I encourage you to pause the recording, pause the video, and then what we're going to do is go into a review. So I don't know whether we're going to... we'll pause there at the moment, allow you to do the exercise, and then for you afterwards can watch the review portion of essentially how I solve the problem or one way to solve the problem. It's important to note that during the review process, there's many ways you can solve the problem. And if your answer is different than the one that I come up with, that's completely all right. So let's talk a little bit about each one of these 6 scenarios that we're going to cover in this adventure. So the first one is finding the arc. And in this one, we're going to focus on refactoring an existing test suite. And in this, we're going to come across a test suite that covers a lot of different sort of avenues or paths through the code in this recipe. And this test suite covers all the content, essentially covers all the paths through the code, but it's really bloated, right? It covers a lot of things and it repeats itself quite a bit, and it's becoming very difficult to maintain. So we're going to look at RSpec's let helper and shared examples to find ways that we can refine our test suite to make it a little more clear, more succinct in our essentially in our expression, and that way it'll make it easier for us to maintain, and for new team members, make it more accessible for them to work through. In the second scenario, we are going to continue to focus on refactoring that test suite. So the first few initial refactoring techniques we're going to use, we're going to continue to build on those, and we're going to employ some other important features. We're going to define a Ruby method, show how we can use Ruby methods to make things clearer inside of our test suite. We're going to explore two additional concepts. One is called shared context. It's the ability for us to share information between our test suites and our scenarios. And then some really advanced stuff, some really dark art, sort of alias example group 2. And I'll get to that when we get to the scenario. It's more of a bonus thing that you can look at. The first scenario and the second scenario are very similar to each other. We're working on the same files, trying to make our test suite more succinct. And this is more of the advanced part of it, and lets us look at some of the really powerful things that we can do just by the pure fact that ChefSpec is built in RSpec. Then we look at the ARC itself. So we have this ARC cookbook that we're going to be using in other cookbooks, and it provides a custom resource for us. Now the thing is, before we go running off and start using this powerful tool, we want to make sure we can test it in a few scenarios. And that's what we're going to do in this section. We're going to set up, or at least I'm going to talk you through the process of defining or creating a fixture cookbook, and then defining a bunch of tests that are going to help us exercise our cookbook in many different ways without having to define an additional recipe inside of our cookbook that's like a test recipe. This way we'll explore all the paths through the code that are important, that exercise our custom resource that we built inside of this cookbook. We'll test some things like the notifications of subscriptions. We'll look at some really powerful things in ChefSpec related to essentially custom resources. With that, we've created the cookbook essentially, we've refactored it, and we've tested it, and we feel like it's strong enough to use in another cookbook. So we're going to take the ARC's custom resource, and we're going to employ it inside of another cookbook, the Python cookbook. And in that Python cookbook, we're going to use a custom resource to take care of a bunch of code that was previously being taken care of, in a one-off way, a handmade, bespoke way. The ARC cookbook's now going to take care of that, so we're going to remove the original implementation and replace it with our custom resource code. And then we're going to do something here where we're going to actually implement our own custom resource within our Python cookbook. So we're going to do something very similar to the ARC cookbook, but we're going to do it from scratch and explore some of the initial, some of the concepts that'll get you initially started with custom resources if you haven't already worked with them. With that custom resource created, so we have a cookbook, the ARC cookbook, that is going to be used within the Python cookbook. This Python cookbook is now going to be used within our Golden Cobra cookbook. And within the Golden Cobra cookbook, we're going to employ that custom resource, and then we're going to look at ways we can stub out data. Particularly when you have recipes that require a chef server to return data to you, either from a data bag or some sort of node object information. We'll use ChefSpec to stub that information, allowing us to have tests that give us better coverage and faster coverage that will not require, a chef server to be essentially uploaded with all that information in a test environment. We'll be able to get feedback right away. And then finally, a bonus, sort of an advanced section at the end, we'll look at ways in which we can test helper methods within our cookbooks. So when you start to define your own helper methods within cookbooks, it becomes very powerful to be able to test them. Because when you start testing helper methods, you're actually just testing Ruby code. And when you just test Ruby code, the tests execute a lot quicker. You get feedback a lot faster, but it requires a little bit more tricks, a little bit more understanding about some ideas about test doubles. So setting up stubs, mocks, things like that. and setting up expectations about allowing calls to happen on these test doubles that we create. So when we get to that section, we'll really explore what is truly some RSpec testing, just doing some straight Ruby code testing. And I'll explain a little bit of how you can make that code a little clearer and cleaner throughout your development. So when you start building your own helper methods, you might be considerate of some techniques that we learn in this process. Now, here is the content that I want you to download to participate with this. So this is the location that contains the whole workshop, all the cookbooks that we're going to work through in all of these scenarios. So I encourage you to download this or clone this repository, and then you'll have this locally on your machine. And during each one of these exercises, like I say, you'll be able to pause or stop the recording and then work through the exercises and then follow through with the review with me. So are you ready for this adventure? Let's get started. And welcome again to Advanced Dungeons and Testing Dragons, Temple of the Golden Cobra.